Welcome to our podcast. This is a joint production of the Civics Factor with Mark McInnes and Canada's Social Changemakers with me, Justin Douglas. Today we'll be in conversation with Lynn Hancock, where we'll discuss COVID-19 and how it's affecting the Canadian political system, civic engagement, democracy, environmentalism, and the environmental movement, as well as a whole other plethora of Canadian politically charged topics. Lynn holds a PhD in political science from Yale University. She now teaches political science within the Canadian university system, and she's worked for the government in different capacities, including studying the relationship between environmentalism, globalism, and the political and economic status quo. Mark holds a BA in history from the University of Victoria. He's been involved at all political levels, including running as a municipal candidate. He currently works as a government policy analyst, and in his spare time hosts the podcast, The Civics Factor, which you can find at civicsfactor.com and wherever you get your podcasts. And me, Justin Douglas, I am the host of Canada's Social Changemakers. I have a degree in political science from the University of Victoria and double majored in civil and common law at McGill University, but I've left the legal and political world to pursue professional acting, yoga, and my YouTube series. So let's get the conversation started. Mark, why don't you just give us a little overview of what you think is going on right now, COVID-19 in Canada, how are we doing?
I was watching it, I think, at first in awe at just how quickly the Overton window, just how much like what wasn't possible before was now being possible. And like I love American and hate American politics. But it was so interesting to watch people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the House and Senate Democratic leaders, respectively, actually move away from giving Americans some kind of stimulus check, and it was instead conservatives and Republicans who were going, yes, let's do it. They may have been doing it for selfish reasons, for re-election. We see Trump has actually like stalled the issuance of the stimulus checks in order to actually just put his signature on it. But it was just interesting to see like how things kind of flip and how ideology can get sort of take a back seat now when we're looking at a problem that confronts us. And that's kind of like how I think we need to view ideology, as these tool sets we come to the table with in order to tackle the problems that we have in front of us. And sometimes if our ideology doesn't match what the problem needs to correct it or solve it or address it, we have to start going, with some humility, remove the ego, remove the ideology and our connection and our attachment to it, and start thinking about this in terms of like the problems that we have. So it's very interesting to watch these developments with COVID-19, but I also have this like ongoing persistent cynicism that the dynamics that existed before are going to rear their heads again. And whatever semblance of progress we might be making on whether it's universal basic income or moving our democracy towards online modes and methods, the forces of the status quo will exert themselves in order to maintain a status quo that benefited them. And we'll see kind of like a freeze frame on the economy as it was, as imperfect as it was, and we're going to try to move back to that, notwithstanding all these things such as like, as of today, negative value oil prices or something. Completely unprecedented as our challenges.
Hi, Lynn, welcome. How has COVID-19 been affecting you, and what is your general impression of the situation right now?
I work in government, and my work has obviously been affected by COVID on a personal level. It's sort of been an all hands on deck situation where people are mobilized to address their ministry's response to this issue and to develop new policies in a really rapid basis. And even if those are temporary policies, that process has been really interesting, because the old adage about government is that it's so slow it almost moves backwards, or some would say it does move backwards. And this emergency response process has been really interesting. It's something that you've seen in the past, for example, when 9/11 happened and the Bush administration was able to go to war like that, right? So you see these really quick policy developments, and while the speed is interesting, and in some cases it's very much essential, you also have to question what are the long-term implications of those rapid-fire decision-making processes in terms of what the recovery from this situation is going to be like. I mean, anyone can see like the government is spending money hand over foot very rapidly. Every government at every level of government is spending money. And as someone who's firmly on the left wing or left wing, I would say, right. Certain bias that's present here. So I could say, I'm happy to see the government spending money on social programs. I'm happy to see investments go into healthcare and education and all these things. But of course, as a rational human being, I also have to be concerned about the long-term implications of that spending when we are coming out of an economy, as Mark said, that the status quo is very strong and it's deeply rooted in exploitative capitalism that, when the check comes due, where is the money to pay for this going to come from? And is it going to come from those old ways of thinking? And then I guess on a different point, I'm also working in education. And it's been really interesting to see how much can be done online and also how little effort we've put up until now into teaching educators how to teach online. I can certainly say that through my entire graduate degree, I don't think I had a single meeting or phone call with a professor online. I don't think I had a single class where there was any digital component, and that's at the graduate level. But that's where we're training our teachers for higher education, and there's no thought paid to that. So it's going to be really interesting to see how those adaptations force a new way of thinking about education and about learning and the value.
Yeah, it's really, you bring a great point in, because for me, I feel like the situation right now is so rapidly changing. We've never experienced something like this in our modern history. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, a third wave. We don't know if it's going to be a long-term thing, the social isolation, social distancing, and how that's really affecting not only politics, but every aspect of our lives in general as Canadians. And so I think that's a lot for us to unpack as we sort of have this conversation. Mark, what do you think, and how do you feel that Canada has done so far with the outbreak? What are your first impressions of what we've done right, and what can we improve on a little bit?
Well, the impressions I've been having as the responses have sort of grown and been expanded on by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government, it's felt like they tried to put like as small of a cover as was needed at the beginning, and has been slowly kind of expanding that outwards. And I think primarily of like the Canada Economic Relief, whatever,
CERB.
The last one, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, it wasn't covering not nearly as many people that was being affected by the restrictions on the economy. And it's been slowly been expanded outward now to actually cover people. Now we're at a place where it's like sex workers who aren't being covered. I'm sure that they will come up with language that will cover even sex workers as they should. It's just showing like how we're kind of doing this in somewhat patchwork ways, and it's kind of leading towards this, like, at the end point of that is like basic income. Essentially, if nobody is working, then so it just kind of feels like it's the logical conclusion to that. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it does seem like it's getting a lot of traction, not only in Canada, but in other countries around the world, especially in social democratic Nordic countries. The idea of a basic income, and even today, the National Huffington Post released an article saying it would take about $22,000 per person to have a basic income to pull all low-income Canadians out of poverty. So it does feel like we are moving in that direction. Lynn, do you agree?
Yeah, I think we're moving in that direction, but I think that sort of policy needs to be backed up with pretty aggressive progressive taxation, and those conversations are not really being had, and that concerns me. Like, we can't bankrupt our national coffers for the sake of providing universal basic income unless we're backing it up with serious changes to the way that we tax corporations and wealthy individuals in this country and in those other countries. I mean, when you look at the US, like, where is that money going to come from unless they're going to start putting a similar cap on income, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, just to offer a different perspective, I feel like a lot, like if you look at the American military industrial complex and the amount of money that goes towards that, as opposed to the individuals, and even in the bailout that they just offered, I think it was something like $1.5 trillion went to billionaires and millionaires as opposed to the average citizen. So when we talk about where money is coming from, I do feel like there is a big pot. It's just where, like you mentioned, who are we taxing at what level, what participation level. The oil and gas industry is something I want to bring into the conversation in terms of both, is it relevant to be investing in oil and gas at this point? Are there new green technologies? And if we are going to bail out the oil and gas sector, what benefit are we getting as a country? So maybe you want to tackle that one a little bit while we're on the topic.
Sure. I mean, as a UVic professor, I signed a general letter to Justin Trudeau and to Parliament saying that we were not in support of the bailout of the oil and gas industry, and that this is particularly, I think these concerns are particularly pertinent at this time. I certainly take your point, but I think that those bailouts usually come from an empty pot. So I think we still have that secondary question of how to fill the pot back up. And I do think that that's going to require some more creative thinking about corporate taxes and individual taxes and tax loopholes. I mean, what are we?
It's creative thinking, but it's also a cultural discussion that we're not having right now. And I think that's been very much engendered and cultivated over decades. So like, I got a BA in history, so I like by far have the least in terms of academic credentials among the three of us.
Doesn't matter.
What I love to study though, like just my ADHD brain at the time was like propaganda. I love studying dehumanization. I had a big thing for like human rights and social justice. Such a wiener for it. Like there's some fantastic resources about like how, particularly during the Cold War, you had all these different kinds of marketing tools that were coming into its own and being developed. And the psychology at the time was also making like leaps and bounds of progress. And that was basically used to go from, say, marketing people to buy products now to getting people on side with a political idea. And I think over, like, when we talk about the over 200, basically this idea of like, what is in people's minds? What is the popular imagination for what is the problem, and what is possible for the solutions that would be out there? And so I look at like these protesters in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and I think like they haven't diagnosed the problem as being like, whether the sickness is real or not, this is government imposing itself on us, being tyrannical, possibly with an agenda of world control or like population control, and whatever Bill Gates wants to do, and their prescription for it is to reopen the economy. At no point in their minds is it to give a basic income. At no point is it, and I think that is actually the kind of discussion we need to have. Same thing with progressive taxation, but the attitudes that's there among the populace just isn't being had because it's been conditioned out of us to even think that way.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Which is also a really good transition into the Canadian system in general. And there is a broader discussion of whether capitalism in its current form of the neoliberal serving self is actually what we need to be encouraging at this point. And if it's not, what alternatives are there that aren't dictatorial communism or some other form of dictatorship? What does democratic socialism look like if that is an alternative to capitalism? Because it feels like the COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity for us to self-reflect on what's working in our system and what isn't. And so I don't know, maybe you guys have some thoughts on that. What is working? What isn't? Is capitalism the future? Are we looking at a new model emerging?
Well, I think actually something you said earlier, Mark, kind of resonated with me. You were talking about how you felt that there was a sort of a shift in ideology, at least in the short term, in order to address some of these concerns, like the Republican Party signing on to distribute checks to people, something that you wouldn't have seen 6 months earlier, let alone years earlier. And I think that what that really raises, though, is that the public, and then these protests that are happening all over the US, and I mean, in Canada as well, we saw some in Vancouver recently. And what I think this really raises is that I think that the public ideology is more intractable than the political ideology. So what politicians do and believe is more flexible, because they have more transparent, sorry, I was just distracted by the little text box that popped up there. They have more transparent objectives, whereas the public is often kind of like being led along by this political rhetoric, which is very extreme and is kind of directing them one way or another. And so I think that is something that we need to address and fundamentally change, which is the extent to which we're allowing individuals and groups in society to become polarized by political rhetoric that's inherently self-serving, and is being spat out without a lot of thought to the long term. And I don't know if that means educating politicians about the implications of what they're saying and how they're going about saying it, or if it means putting restrictions on airtime for that sort of talk, and placing heavy restrictions on sites like Facebook, which allow the echo chamber to kind of amplify those ideas. Those are just some kind of general thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, talk about like potential for shifting some of that. I won't speak too much on like, moving from neoliberal to democratic socialist. I have this weird allergy for labels, because I find that's one of those things that would be conditioned to go. We hear socialism, we hear communism. It's like we make these associations now with it that anything resembling even socialism or communism is immediately going to lead to our ruination, to our loss of livelihood, to starvation and breadlines. So like all this stuff here that we've been sort of been trained to think as. So I'll stay away from that. But in terms of like potentials, the sense of community that people can now come back to in some ways by the isolation that we're finding and under quarantine, and people are having to rely on one another, whether it's like sourdough starter, or if it's to like help gardening or something like that, or people banging pots at 7 p.m. every evening. There is a kind of solidarity and even class consciousness that's kind of arising out of that, which is fantastic. So I do think there's a potential for some of that to also coalesce into these conversations about how can we shift into more like what works and what doesn't, because having an ideological reflex to the problems at hand is not going to work, and hasn't been working. I think also with when it comes to some of that online stuff, I think there's a huge potential for the way we connect with one another online. Like I have this theory that debate can actually be done better online. Like if our, and I remember interviewing the deputy speaker years ago about this of the House of Commons to talk to about like what ways can we move debate online? Because when you move it online, you take away people's sort of like short-term impulses to become inflamed and to speak really aggressively and with ad hominems to each other. I didn't realize at the time that that's all fucking scripted. But anyway, so my idea was of like, if you have actually like good faith participants using evidence-based reasoning, who are citing their sources, who are actually addressing the issues, who have an understanding of logical fallacies and know to stay away from them, you also have a written record, like a Hansard, which you can easily bring up and point out where someone is using a logical fallacy. And the whole point is to try and disqualify people from using that, or at least try to minimize, not necessarily disqualify people, but you're trying to encourage better ways of how we talk with one another about politics. And if we can make it more constructive by using technology to basically format the way we do engage with one another, that's an amazing opportunity to change how the level of conscious discussion as well as potentially some of the outcomes, because what that changes is how politicians now have to interact with their voters. Because one of the big issues we have is this dynamic of how political parties compete for votes. There's an incentive to manipulate and exploit people's knowledge and what people don't know in order to get into power and to stay into power. And I think that's such an important status quo force that we have to reckon with. And there's absolutely potential there.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you said there to unpack. First, I'll just go back to the labels. I agree with you. I don't think it's been generally healthy to labelize things to a certain extent, but also it's people's reference point. And I think that people from the right have been very good at demonizing anything to do with democratic socialism because it takes away their power. And if you look at the things that probably Canadians value most throughout this crisis is a healthcare system, a public healthcare system, which would fall under the guise of socialism. All of these checks, the CERB program itself is a social enterprise, right? It's bailing the Canadian people out when they have economic loss. And so all of these things that we think are scary socialist tendencies are actually the things that people really value in an emergency. And it's also the idea that we are a community, that Canada, Canadians across the board have something that ties us together beyond our own individual needs. And I think that's even been more made clear by the understanding that part of the reason we're staying home is so that people who are vulnerable in our society are going to be less likely to get sick. And I think of my grandmother, I think of people with autoimmune diseases. And so that's part of my own motivation for adhering to the social distancing orders is that maybe I have a good immune system and maybe I'll stay healthy, but I know that the people around me won't. And so anyway, but I do also like what you had to say about technology and online discussions and how that's sort of changing the face of the conversation. And it is a huge component of what is happening now, because if you'll remember prior to the start of COVID-19, there were some pretty major protests going on around the world in terms of environmentalism. And now all of a sudden these protests, mass protests, with the exception of some right-wing crazies, with all due respect, right-wing people have different views, that most of the environmental protests, the indigenous protests that were going on opposed to the pipelines, have all been sort of flattened at this point. But is there a way for people who want to stay involved to be so through an online mechanism? So I'll throw that to you first, Lynn.
It's a different way of thinking. I think that we've come to think of like digital conversations as like lacking a certain sincerity and a certain element of risk that's inherent in the way we think about protests. So like the kind of preeminent protests that we can think of in our mind involve like a level of personal risk in order to defend an idea that is worth defending, right? So like you can think of recently like the protests in China, you can think of, in Hong Kong, you can think about the protests during the Vietnam War in the US. You know, any like successful protest movement, I think, involves this element of personal risk being taken in order to defend an idea, and that kind of provides some level of validity of the protest in people's minds. Now, that's not to say that that can't happen online. It's just that there needs to be a reframing of the way we think about the actual action of protesting and what it entails and what are the effective mechanisms for it. So I don't know that I have the answer to what those will be, because you can't do a sit-in, you can't block people's commute, you can't get in their faces, and you can't put yourself at risk in order to show the importance of this idea to you. And with things like the environment, I would say that those elements, like getting in people's face, are really important, because people just don't take it seriously when it seems like an abstract idea to them.
Yeah, I also feel like there's this idea of laissez-faire activism online. And by that, I mean, you see a petition, and you're like, oh, I signed the petition, I've done my part, hands off, or I like someone's Facebook status, that was me showing that I care about this issue, and I don't need to do any more. Mark, thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. Like the slacktivism or the armchair activist thing of, I think there's like a very big element of like, and the scientists at Facebook know this, the dopamine that gets released when you show solidarity online to something, when you sign something, when you like something, or when you get likes for something that you post online. there's like a release of dopamine, and you get some serotonin from that, and like you actually feel good. But it's kind of a dulling. It's a nullification of actions that would happen in the real world. I think there is, like, I wish there was some app that politicians and political parties used, that would basically be the pollster for society here, and you could actually get like a better sense of people really care about something. This is your official petition to raise it, and it would have like some way of showing that politician, this is the amount of support that you have in your community here that cares about this, and it's logged and it's being kept here, so that come election time, people won't suffer short-term memory loss, or what our short attention span is notoriously bad in democracies, particularly. And if we had some way of being able to track that was I guess adhered to by people who are in decision-making roles, and well used by the public, that would be fantastic. Fantastic. I'll try to edit that out. But it's this underlying, like, and here's the other aspect of this here, is that our public square where we gather has essentially moved online, and it's been inherited by basically three large companies of Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And that, like, these are essentially nerds who were very socially awkward all through high school, and then got out and then worked in garages and figured out the software to make these multi-billion-dollar companies that govern the way we now talk to one another and how we like have relationships and actually come together to discuss some of these issues that we commonly have. That's an immense amount of power to give to them. And they're not necessarily good faith. They're not necessarily competent, and they don't necessarily have the best interests of like evolving a democracy in a constructive way at heart. They're money-making machines, and they're very good at that. So maybe, like, I'll put it back to you guys here. Like, what do you think we can do about the public square moving online, and like, what are some ways that we can try to address that?
That's a huge question. I mean, that's one of the biggest questions right now. And I do feel like not just the online platforms, but media in general, mainstream media at this point. You mentioned that there's three sort of big players within the internet world right now, but even within mainstream media, there's six big players. And most of what Canadians consume through the media has a very particular perspective. And generally it is a capitalistic, corporate, profits first perspective that isn't generally in the public's best interest. And so there's a huge conversation now because so many media outlets who rely on advertising are now not getting that advertising revenue. And so already local newspapers are starting to fold under, and there's a lot of questions now of where are we going to get our media from? And so when it comes to like Facebook, the news stories that you get on Facebook tend to be ones that are within your algorithm. So you're going to find pieces that already appeal to you or have some sort of value or clickbait, basically, in order for you to engage more. So it's not like we as leftist people are going to have information that goes with our particular perspectives. And people who maybe have a different, more right-wing ideology are going to have a lot more right-wing news about how Justin Trudeau is destroying the country and oil and pipe gas lines, and yay, Doug Ford and Jason Kenney and all the great work that they're doing, as opposed to my Facebook news stream, which is like, this Indigenous rights group is filing for this court case, and animal rights activists are here doing this kind of stuff. So I think already the news and information that we get is very skewed. So that's why I think it's more important than ever before to have grassroots media organizations, like the work that you're doing with the Civics podcast, civic engagement, the Civics Factor, the stuff that I'm doing with Just in Canada, which has been on pause for a little while. But I think that's where it comes down to, is now grassroots activists. And there's also a huge question about how do we engage people in the political sphere when a lot of people generally tune out politics.
I think those are great points. I would add on to that those algorithms also affect how people would find grassroots media analysts, right? So like there's content creators, and there's people who cover the news, and then there's analysts. And right now it's they're favoring like what you hear with YouTube and Adpocalypse. It's been a lot of favoring CNN and Fox News and MSNBC because the panel that Google has been using is made up of people from those areas, and so like what they think is legitimate media is getting favored of that. So even then, like it's that corporatization is now sort of removing and sort of disenfranchising a lot of the more grassroots people.
Yeah, I mean, I think education is more important now than ever, especially with the need for discerning critical examination of what it is that you're consuming, even passively consuming. So to me, that means that with this move online for classrooms, like universities, high schools, elementary schools need to be having those conversations about media and bias and corporate, well, I'm going to call it corporate greed, but you might call it corporate interest, and how that kind of affects the type of information that you're receiving online, the way that you receive information, and the things that you absorb being kind of heavily skewed by that money-making goal. So it's kind of amazing to me because students get to university level without having those critical examination skills and never really having thought twice about the fact that, you know, a newspaper article might not be a unbiased source of information about the world. To most university students and to most people, I'd say, in Canada and across the world, information that's published in a reputable source is inherently valid and unbiased and factual, truthful. So yeah,
I want to jump in there with so I'm not sure if you've heard of Hallin's Spheres. That was introduced to me kind of recently here by someone I interviewed, Ethan Zuckerman, who's the director at the Center for Civic Media at MIT. And he discussed these basically like you have three sort of concentric circles, and the innermost one is like the most legitimate sort of news and things that are going on that the media will cover, and they're instantly legitimized by them covering it. And then you have things that that there's a conscious decision somewhere, editorial boards or what have you, where they go, this is an actual debate that we're allowed to have. And then beyond that is the deviance. And that's the one where it's like, it's completely unthinkable. And so like, it's similar to the Overton window, where it's like the Overton window has to do with like what people popularly understand and can imagine. Hallin's Spheres more has to do with like, here's how the media sort of interacts with that and has a very influential role to play in what people understand. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting. I do want to circle though to, you talked about like students and schools and education happening. One of the things that I have to talk about with people when it comes to my podcast and what I like to talk about is like, I don't think civics education is just a unit that we should really focus on and like do more of in high school. I think it's like, it's an actual analytical, it's a whole realm of things here. And I basically boil it down to it's problem solving, and it's group problem solving. It's coming together with other people who have different worldviews and have different ways of looking at things and trying to work through some problems. That's real civics at its core. But now that everybody's at home, do you think like we'll grow, and here's maybe some thinking that will be challenging, we'll grow our respect for teachers and maybe show different material support for them at the outcome?
That's the dream, right? Look, when people ask me what I studied at Yale, I can tell them, you know, I studied so-and-so, like this set of information. But realistically, what a PhD is a degree in critical thinking. It's 6 years of your life dedicated to becoming as critical and nitty-gritty as you can possibly be. And any PhD student, I would say, in the world graduates with that skill set. And that skill set is more valuable than any piece of information I've learned in any other part of my education. So I think that there is a whole, you know, slew of people out there who have those skills and who have probably some teaching experience and who want to convey that information. But universities, like other institutions, are money-making machines that are very good at what they do and aren't particularly interested in allowing that group of people to have gainful, steady, stable employment. So the academic job market is just a shit show, for lack of a better word. And it puts a lot of really great people in the position of having to teach like adjunct positions with no tenure possibilities and no job stability and no security. So I think if you want the people with the trained critical thinking skills teaching a new generation of young people to have critical thinking skills, then you have to start providing opportunities for them to be stably employed at universities and at good schools across the world. And I think that requires a shift away from adjuncting, which is cheap but shitty for everyone involved.
Wow.
Yeah, even on a larger scale, I can only speak to my experience at the University of Victoria and then at McGill. Mm-hmm. But especially at McGill, it felt to me like it was still an old boys club.
Yeah.
In terms of the knowledge, in terms of the professors, in terms of the style of teaching, it was still very much based on, here's a book, learn the book. We're going to give you an exam. It's going to be 100% of your grade. I know it works a little bit differently in law than some of the other departments. And there are these little inklings of innovation. And like the McGill law markets itself very much on, we're a human rights university and you can study and learn about human rights. And then you get there and realize that there's no paying jobs in human rights. That's not something that exists. What they do have is a lot of law firms that try to recruit you. And then you see what kind of cases are actually coming forth. Like you think that the Supreme Court deals with all these great human rights cases, but the actual truth is it's actually a very small portion of the cases that they deal with. Most of the cases that come across the Supreme Court are actually to do with international trade and business law and intellectual property and all of these things that are important, sure, contracts, but don't actually have much impact on the average Canadian citizen. And so when we're looking at education across the board, there needs to be some massive rethinking because there's so many, apart from the university, but for kids in school, we still want them to fit into this box of education. Like you need to sit in this classroom for 8 hours a day and absorb everything I'm saying and just sit there. And if you don't, then you're going to get some ADD medication because you're not supposed to be creative. You're not supposed to be an out of the box thinker. We're teaching you how to think. And so I think that's going to be a big shift that needs to happen is education that serves the student rather than the student trying to serve the education. And I think that's what you're saying also too about teachers. Like we need professors and teachers who can pay their bills and who can doesn't have to be an exorbitant lifestyle, but comfortable enough that you can actually focus on teaching your kids without having to spend your time getting a second or third part-time job in order to have your basic needs met. And so my experience with higher education was very disillusioning, and which is why I left the legal market altogether. I just felt like, why would I devote so much of my time and energy into this when I care about social justice and human rights, when the system is intrinsically doesn't care about these things, doesn't value these things. So anyway, that was my little rant about my educational experience.
I had a very similar experience as to you both here. I worked at Sobeys for 5 years. In all seriousness, the amount of people that I have met or have heard of or have watched or listened to that have left high-paying jobs to enter something where they're helping people, to me is kind of a sign that we're really, the economy is kind of a mismatch with what's out there is a mismatch for what people are really lit up and passionate about doing. The amount of people that are going into the healthcare professions is a real boon to the human spirit of cooperation and wanting to help each other and consideration for other people's welfare and community welfare. But we certainly don't prioritize it to the extent of providing it material supports to make sure that it can do it even effectively, even before the crisis of COVID-19. Maybe we can talk a bit about like some of that resource scarcity and relate it to, potentials and risks.
Again, I think it comes down to the capitalist values. Like if you are on a corporate shareholder board, you are loyal to, you have to think about profits. That is the only thing that matters. It's not about customer satisfaction. It's not about whether you're doing the right thing as a business. It's not about whether you're protecting the environment. It's, is your company profitable and how can we be more profitable? And that is the only loyalty that you have. And I've also worked in the not-for-profit sector for a bunch of different organizations over my lifespan. And as much as I value and appreciate everyone who's working in that sector, what they're trying to accomplish, it's often band-aid solutions. And if they were actually really effective at meeting their stated goals, then they would almost will themselves out of existence. And so you can see now with a lot of the corporate side, it's money, profits, and the not-profit side, even though there's great goodwill, it's still a lot about getting funding. Where do we get money from? And once we do get money, a lot of it goes to administration, and then you have all these different competing values within it. So that, I know that's a big topic when we're talking about risk and all these different things, but there needs to be some reevaluation. And what is our actual goal? Is it for more profits in society, or is it about protecting the environment? Is it about protecting human rights? Is it about having food on your table? Is it about having organic produce? Is it moving away from agribusiness into organic farming and stabilized food economy? Like that's a big conversation, so I'll just stop there. But there's a lot that needs to change within the structure in order to actually address the real problems that we face right now in our society.
I think those are great connections. The reason why we don't have money, and I can speak of this from either BC's experience or the experience of other governments that exist within a neoliberal sort of paradigm of things and outlook of things, is that governments just have like a few ways of making money. And I generalize it as like two streams. You either tax people, which is like the obvious way that governments make money. And then there's negotiating a dividend off of economic growth. So on one of them here, you're going to have to raise taxes on an electorate that can vote you out in the next election. It's not politically, electorally advantageous to tax your voters. And not all of them are capable of giving over that money anyway, because you can't necessarily tax the poor because it's like bleeding a stone, although they do get taxed quite a bit. If you tax the middle class, they're much more reliable voters, and that's a dangerous thing. There's other people that exist in the political ecosystem that will say, you worked hard for that money, why are you letting these people tax and spend it for people that may not even deserve it? Because we also have a cultural attitude about people who deserve help and who doesn't, and a cultural attitude about people to need to raise themselves up by their bootstraps, work on their own merits, and make it. That's one stream of things, is that taxation. And by the way, if you try to tax rich people, they will make you suffer for it, and they'll find a way. But the other way of things is negotiating dividends off of economic growth, which is what BC has been doing with LNG and with pipelines and gas here, which is we're going to try to cultivate as best a favorable tax regime to bring in that investment. And that investment money, whatever they make off of that, we're going to tax some of that profit that they get from that. And that's how we're going to fund all the social things that we say we want to do. So already you're at like a disadvantage because you're negotiating with entities who are supranational. These are multinational corporations. They have no loyalty to any particular country. Their country is money. And you're going to them going, we're not gonna do anything really tough in order to, we don't have any other option here, right? We need you to do well in order for us to get your crumbs that you will give us, because we promised our voters that we're going to do all these social things. So taxation was off the table while trying to make money off of what LNG. We have China and Russia making $140 billion deals with one another over LNG. That's a non-starter for BC. We're years behind in productive capacity to do that. Oil is, infamously right now below negative value. It's been completely just destroyed as a resource right now. And that's, even without a pandemic, you also had like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela and the US as the largest producers of oil and shale gas. So it's like we're trying to compete with these people. So the corporations that want to do business with our governments know this, and they use that to their advantage. So they're actually in a stronger position to negotiate that. And all that happens here is we don't now have enough money to pay for the services that people need. So so I make these connections that are way up here, and then I'm in tent city trying to help somebody work through their shit and advocate for them with a system that's going to give them bare minimum anyway. And it's like and it's simply because of CERB and the other things that are going on right now that they actually have a better base in order to come back from it. But they still got to do all these other things, and there's still a scarcity of resources to help that. And it's been like that in our healthcare systems, particularly in any public healthcare system. Austerity and scarcity has been an issue, and it is for those reasons I just laid out.
Yeah, I would offer a counter perspective on that as well. I want to get Lynn's voice in here again really soon, but just to say, I think that's also a narrative that we're constantly told, is that if we want this corporation to work here, we have to meet its needs, because otherwise it's going to jump markets and go somewhere else. But the reality is, especially when we're talking about forestry, oil, gas, they want what we have. We actually have a lot more bargaining power than we give ourselves credit for. And if we actually demanded higher revenues, better environmental protections, they would stay because they want to do business in Canada. You don't want to go to Venezuela, where there's the potential for the entire economy to collapse, for political instability. Canada is a stable democracy. We have a lot of resources here, and we don't value our own resources or ourselves. We give them away for free. So they actually want to do a lot of business here. And we could actually tax them at a much higher rate, like Norway. For example, the example that they give is they have the Public Protection Fund. So they have billions of dollars that they put aside in cases of emergency for environmental protection, and because they demanded that from the oil companies. Here, we don't ask for those same levels of taxation, of income, and I think that we undervalue what we actually can ask for. And it's the same with the healthcare, this idea that when there's public resources, if you want to privatize, if your agenda is to privatize these things like public healthcare, take out as much funding as possible, squeeze the system so that people think that healthcare publicly isn't working, that the only way to do it is to privatize it. And so you can see that with BC Ferries under Gordon Campbell. He privatized them because it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more effective, prices are not going to go up, services are going to stay the same. And as you can see, services have been closed, prices have gone up, the level of money that the employees make has gone down. And so it's this constant narrative that we're being fed, that the only way to work with these businesses is to meet them at their needs. And I think that's a false narrative. I think the true narrative is we have a lot more power than we give ourselves.
Well, it's a bluff, right? And it's one that we don't really call. And I think like SNC-Lavalin is maybe a good example of that, where there was, this implicit threat that if you go ahead with corruption charges against my company, then I'm going to close up our headquarters, and all 5,000 people that are in your riding, Mr. Prime Minister, will know that it was because of your government and your actions that cost them their jobs. And there was debate about whether that was even said. That's kind of like, that is the quid pro quo. That is like kind of the bluff that's being made here, which would you see that as analogous?
I think the grand hypocrisy of the Canadian narrative is that we're above things like slave labor and massive exploitation of the environment and of people, that our democracy and history forbid those things, that we are capable of surviving off our own merits. And I think that we should, that maybe that maybe one paradigm shift that needs to happen is we need to actually back that hypocrisy, sort of take a step back and think, do we want to do business with some of these companies? Yes, they're billion-dollar companies. Yes, they're making people a lot of money. But do we really want to build our economy and our way of life around pandering to corporations that, for lack of a better word, enslave people, to corporate greed? And I guess, I mean, I realize that this is like an incredibly idealistic thing to say. This is like saying, let's shut down oil production altogether because it's bad for the environment, and just see where the chips fall and see what happens to the economy. And, you know, I'm not.
I think it's a great point. I think that would actually be really useful as well to incorporate into, as Justin was talking about, a more constructive narrative that actually furthers those values, which is to call the bluff on it and say, like, look, there's more than enough people, entrepreneurs, willing to step forward and fill the gaps. So, you know, you're saying you are going to take away these workers. Well, these workers can find jobs with other companies that actually have good values and do good things for the world. So I like your point.
Yeah, I think that it is a part of calling the bluff, is saying that it is calling our politicians to hold to account those values that we say are important to us, that we hold dear in Canada. I mean, I think it's just insane that we bow down to corporations like Amazon, knowing the conditions that workers in the United States and Canada are working in. That we bow down to corporations like Apple, which use child labor to build their devices, and which use incredibly exploitative and environmentally damaging mining practices for the key components of the devices that they're pulling up. Like, we're really willing to just do anything to appeal to these massive corporations to bring a little bit of business to Canada. But I mean, to be begging for crumbs from the bad guys, it's questionable behavior. And I think that there's space to at least have the conversation about whether that's even a valid business to try and court for Canada.
And there's so many examples, which is the Saudi's arms deal, the coal mining companies. There are so many examples of Canadian international companies violating human rights laws in other countries that we would not allow that to happen here, or we think we would not allow that to happen here. And so I agree with you. There needs to be some serious conversation about that. But then again, that goes back to engaging the Canadian electorate into these issues that we obviously care about. But how do we engage other people who don't necessarily know about these things, care about these things? They want, hey, I have 3 kids at home now who I have to homeschool, and I don't know how I'm going to pay my next paycheck. Why are you asking me to like educate myself on what this Saudi arms deal is? You know, like how can we really engage people in order to hold politicians to account? I mean, that's the big question that we've all been asking, I think, for a long time.
I mean, it's part of the ploy too, right? Like, you keep people just desperate enough that they don't have time to question the things that are wrong with their world.
Well, I was going to say, I also think that there maybe is, because of COVID-19, because of the internet, because of more information out there, I do feel like there are more people who are questioning more than before. And I don't have any sort of factual information to back that up, only from my own experience and my own hopes and wishes for this country and the world. But I do feel like we are moving towards a tipping point where people care more about the environment, where they care more about education, about politics, about being involved, about being civically active. And I hope that that's the truth, because it's like the 100 monkeys. I don't know if you guys have heard of this analogy, but there's a bunch of different islands where there's these different monkeys, and all of a sudden one monkey starts using a hammer or a rock as a hammer tool, and then another monkey starts doing it, and another monkey starts doing it, and all of a sudden on a different island that has no connection, the same monkeys or the same species of monkeys inherits the skill of being able to start using a hammer or a stone as a hammer. And then all of a sudden, everyone's doing it. So it's like this idea, it has to infiltrate through the population. And once enough people start to get the idea, it starts to hit mass consciousness. And what I think is happening is that it's starting to hit mass consciousness that our system isn't working. It's not serving the people it's supposed to serve. And you can't exactly put your fingers on what's not working, but something doesn't feel right. And I think enough people are feeling like something doesn't feel right and something needs to change. What that change is, how it's going to manifest, those are a lot of questions that are coming up right now. But I hope that's the case. So to switch topics a little bit, how do you guys feel about COVID-19 and the economy in terms of small businesses? Are small businesses going to be able to weather the storm? Are we doing enough as a country to protect them? What is the future for small businesses in Canada? Preface it more by saying the reason I think that's important is because when you have small businesses or the heart of the middle class in Canada worried about how they're going to stay open, that's when you start getting people engaged. When it starts hitting your table, when it starts hitting your family, then all of a sudden you're like, hey, wait a second. And the fact that most Canadians, most small businesses are one paycheck, 1 month away from closing, shows that there's a significant problem. Like the way that we have been doing business is not sustainable. That there seems to be a real gap that if the economy shuts down, because it's only really been about a month so far, and business owners, small business owners across Canada are losing their shit, and probably rightfully so. But there is a real problem if it takes 1 month to close half of the small businesses in Canada.
It really attacks this idea that like you're supposed to have these rainy day funds. You're supposed to be, a good business person, a responsible individual should have 6 months of rainy day funds should any of this happen. And it's like, most people don't. Multi-billion-dollar companies don't. The individual small business owner doesn't. Most people don't. People all throughout society, up and down, are living paycheck to paycheck because and I'm not sure if this is the right term for it. I'm still trying to find the right metaphor for this, but it's cash flow. It's like you money in, money out. And right now, like the hose that money's going through that is flowing, it's been stepped on because we're freezing the economy in place. We're trying to, by shutting down all of society to maintain social distance and be responsible to our healthcare system and to our vulnerable members in our communities and families. But the expenses are still expected. And so it's just kind of like a basic math problem that I don't think we've quite settled with yet, where it's like you froze the incomes, but you're not going to freeze the expenses. In fact, you will still have a ton of penalties if you don't pay the expenses. And like that to me is just like a basic incompatibility here. It's like this is just a basic math problem. So maybe there's a different way to think of that, though. What do you guys think?
I guess one thing I want to pipe in here with is that we did a lot of damage. We've done a lot of damage to small businesses long before COVID happened. We basically allow the economy to exist in a state that favors these massive conglomerate corporations, multinational corporations, even for things like getting coffee in the morning. More people go to Starbucks and Tim Hortons and groups like that than they go to a small coffee shop, even though the product is superior at the coffee shop. The myth of the economy is that the best product will survive, or that the best companies will survive is just that. It's a myth, right? Essentially, it's about branding, corporate profits that allow you to keep the lights on at the expense of small businesses. So I think we did a lot of damage. We've done a lot of damage to small businesses for a long time. And so it's no surprise that when something like this comes along, we are saying, can they survive? I think that some will. I mean, I still go to the little bakery just across the street from me, and there's people lined up outside the door. They're only open Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but there's people lined up around the block for that bakery. So I like to think that some businesses will, but the reality, I think, is that a lot will close. And the large corporations that I think should close as a result of this will not.
Yeah, I mean, Boeing is asking for a bailout, right? I don't know if they got it, but I mean, that's one example of a corporation that put how much money into buybacks over the last many years, and now they want like taxpayer money basically to go. All that money that they could have had for a rainy day, they spent it all to increase to increase value for their shareholders, and now they're in trouble, and they go, joke, you taxpayer, bail us out.
Just briefly, I was going to say, look at big companies like Chapters, right, which are trying to kind of sell you on them being the Canadian alternative to Amazon. But there's no reason why people can't go and buy books from, a small business, a small bookseller that didn't just lay off 7,000 people or whatever, who at the beginning were only paying, slave labor rates to working in big, essentially book factories that are selling Chinese products to people. So it's like the corporations that are going to survive are branding machines. They're not like good businesses per se.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And what I was going to say also about the airlines, Air Canada, WestJet, laid off all of their employees and then only rehired them on the table so that the employees could get 75% of their income back through the Canadian government, but has chosen not to provide that 25% missing piece, right? So, and they're only doing it in order, you think that it's like a public PR, like, hey, we're getting our employees back on the table so they can get money, but it's actually because they negotiated with the government to get their own bailout package. And that was part of the government's insistence that, hey, you want this bailout, you have to hire back these employees who you laid off 2 days ago and wanted us to give $2,000 bailouts to each one of them. So, I mean, there's just some of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes in the big players is so disgusting, for lack of a better word, that it just really does say, what is a good business? What is a good business in Canada, and what businesses do we value? And then again, in order to protect those businesses, it's our decision, right? Like, why are we going to Tim Hortons and Starbucks as opposed to the local seller?
Mm-hmm. I mean, and again, it's that like branding piece, right? It's the same with the airlines. At the end of this, we're going to be faced with all these advertising campaigns about how they were strong and they survived. We survived this together. And those branding pushes are going to be from companies like Toyota and Amazon. And
Justin, I kind of want to put the question back to you. Do you think, like, what do you think for small businesses? Do you think either enough is being done, and how would you analyze
I
that?
have two minds on it. I think that some small businesses are going to survive. The health and fitness industry, I think, is in a lot of trouble. And so that's yoga studios, gyms.
People are like, I can go outside.
Yeah, exactly. They can go outside for the first time. But if you, and again, to what Lynn's point was before, is that these small businesses were in trouble a long time before the COVID crisis. But now all of these problems are being reflected in a really big way. And so, for example, within the yoga community, most yoga teachers are contract. They're not employees of the yoga studio. And I think that goes for a lot of gyms, a lot of health and fitness studios. So by being a contract employee, the yoga studio doesn't have to pay healthcare. They doesn't have to pay employment insurance. It keeps the cost down for these small businesses. But then the consequence of that is that all of these contractors are working for 5 or 6 different studios, really, like, they're being taken advantage of, and the employees have been being taken advantage of for a long time, and now it's really coming to light. And so even these employees who are getting laid off as self-employed aren't able to get the benefits. So for example, a lot of these fitness studios are moving online, offering classes online, whether it's a yoga or a dance class or whatever within the health and fitness industry. But if teachers are getting paid for their online services, then they were, I mean, it's changed a little bit, but then they were no longer eligible for the CERB funding because they had not been unemployed for 14 consecutive days. And so there's just all of these small little rules and regulations within small businesses that are meant to help small businesses operate as if they are the same capitalist big business structures of taking advantage of employees and trying to get ahead. But now all of these things are really coming to light. And so I think that small businesses are going to have a really hard time weathering this storm. And do I think that's a good thing? I don't know. For some of them, I actually do think some should close because even though small businesses are the heart of the middle class, there needs to be some real conversations about how we've been treating employees. And that goes for frontline workers for our grocery stores, for farm people who are picking the lettuce that we eat, people who are at the bottom of the chain have not been taken care of for a long time. And it's time to recognize that and shift our priorities, because during this crisis, the billionaires are doing nothing for us. It's not Jeff Bezos and all of these guys who are saving us. It is people who are literally have a gun to their head to say, if you don't come to work today and work at this grocery store and put your own health at risk, then you have no income. So there's some real conversations we need to have about who is marginalized in our community, who are at the same time saving our community.
Justin,
be careful, you're starting to sound like a communist.
Fair point.
My uncle told me that on the phone the other day here, where I was talking about like freezing expenses, where like the federal government needs to, negotiate with the central banks to go like freeze the mortgage payments, freeze the debt repayments, like figure out something here so that like you can try to staunch the bleeding that people are doing, because expenses are still being expected, but you're not having any money in. I think that inconsistency has to be handled creatively in some way.
I think the things that really resonate to me about our conversation are the status quo hasn't set us up for success in this brave new world. The economy is broken. The way that we engage with our with politicians is a little bit broken. The way that we engage with each other is a little broken. And to me, what this sounds like is that a lot of it links back to corporatism and our reliance on these big multinational corporations and our willingness to pander to them and let them succeed at all costs. And I think then the solution kind of emerges naturally from that thought, which is that we need to start having really important conversations about how big we let companies and individuals get, how much of our future and our economy and our social lives we give over to these massive conglomerates. And I think that is, just to use Mark's expression, that's about calling their bluff. No one is infinitely powerful in this world. We have the resources and the ability and the brains to be able to challenge these structures, and I think that comes with good education and with good civic engagement. So even conversations like this, getting people in a room and people who agree that there's a problem with the way that we're doing things, but that there's a possibility to actually make a difference and improve matters. Those sorts of activities make me hopeful that we can get through this period and that we can use new ways of thinking to kind of change the world. So I guess I end on a positive note.
That's beautiful. I will echo a lot of what you're saying. For me, I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have some very negative forces who I think would like to take this opportunity to bring in more authoritarian rule, who would like to make more money, profit off of this situation. But on the other hand, I think there's an incredible opportunity for hope and for a new way forward. And so we can go back to whatever the normalcy was, whatever the status quo was before the situation, or we can look at opportunities to evolve into something better. And I really hope that we choose something better.
Excellent. I'll end with, we're trying to address this issue, this global pandemic, using nation states. And nation states are really limited in what they can do when the resources that are needed to do something like address a problem are being hoarded in tax havens all around the world. My default position all the time now is governments can do so much more to help society and do more for society and raise people out of poverty and solve these long-term systemic issues. If only we found a way to convince voters to tax the elites more, not people who think they're rich, because they're likely not, but the actual elites, the people in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and on and on. If we address inequality, we would then have the resources to be able to really effectively problem solve some of these issues that we have. I also want to say that there's many opportunities for reforming democracy, like the ones that we've discussed, and finally ending on. There's another opportunity. My sponsor of my podcast is Tushy, that sells bidets. So with all this toilet paper shortage here, please, you get 20% off if you go to tushy.com/Civics Factor.
Nice little plug there. Thank you guys both. It has been such a pleasure to talk to both of you. I feel really inspired by the conversation. Again, Lynn Hancock, thank you, Mark McInnes. And again, the Civic Factor podcast, civicfactor.com.
Civicsfactor.com.
Civic Factor.
Thank you, Justin. Justin Canada.
Thank you,
This is great.